Buonasera, benvenuti nel Museo del Medio Oriente, Egitto e Mediterraneo della Sapienza. Oggi è sabato 25 maggio 2019 e abbiamo un ospite di eccezione che questa volta non è un archeologo, è un divulgatore, un giornalista svedese che tra poco introdurrò e che ci farà un po' sorridere con una conferenza che sarà in inglese, quindi anche qualche giovane che ci ascolta un modo per esercitarsi, e una conferenza di un taglio diverso, anche per mostrare, diciamo, le potenzialità dell'archeologia nel mondo così dei social e dei media, visto che il nostro giornalista è anche un grande comunicatore. Non so esattamente il titolo della sua comunicazione perché è in svedese, provo a indovinare. Comunque vi show up Philippe Böhstrom, che tutti conoscete perché è autore di articoli importantissimi su molti giornali nazionali e internazionali, in primis il National Geographic, Haaretz, è un giornale israeliano molto famoso, e conosce tantissimi archeologi. Praticamente il suo lavoro è andare negli scavi degli archeologi a capire cosa hanno fatto e tradurlo nella lingua delle altre persone. Però questa sera ha anche delle sue passioni, vedete che oggi ci vuole parlare di Arrivano i vampiri, questa è la mia traduzione, Vampire are coming,
yes,
my gosh, e quindi con un bel applauso salutiamo.
I mean, vampires is probably a topic you have heard about, it's quite a familiar topic, but when we're going to talk about vampire this evening, it's not the typical invention of brokers with the novel of Dracula from 1897, with this count coming out of an iron coffin, rising in the middle of the night, looking for a beautiful girl to put his teeth into. This vampire was something completely different that the ancients feared, and actually in southern and eastern Europe they found hundreds of vampire funerals. So it's quite interesting, and one would wonder why were people so afraid of the undead and thinking they would come alive again. And there's an interesting example, because in 2012 they found in a cemetery in northern Poland, in Böhstrom, they were excavating a cemetery from the 1600s, and they found 297 individuals buried, and 6 of them had been earmarked for vampire funeral. So what is a vampire funeral? Well, some of them had a knife or a sickle placed across the throat, so meaning that if they would dare to rise again, they would be decapitated. Some of them had a sickle also placed around the belly, which would cut them in half. Some had Christian amulets placed in their mouth, and others had coins in their mouth. So they did all they can, sort of proactively prevent them or to fight vampires when they were already in their grave. So they were quite, you know, afraid of the undead rising again. And the archaeologists were very baffled about this. They wondered, you know, why were these individuals earmarked for vampire funerals? At this time in Poland there was a lot of immigration, so perhaps they were immigrants. But they did these bone studies where you can see where they come from, what gender they have, and if they had diseases, and I found out that they were locals. They had no diseases, and there were 3 women, 3 men, 4 grown-ups, 1 was a child, 1 was a teenager, and 1 was a grown-up male, the other 3 was grown-up women. So gender or sex wasn't a factor, so it has to be social factors, perhaps. They had committed suicide, perhaps they were thought to be witches, I don't know, perhaps you have a suggestion, nobody knows actually, but what we do know, that in Bulgaria, in north of Italy, in Venice, in Czechoslovakia, and in other Eastern European countries, they found many vampire funerals, which is quite interesting. And for example, in Venice, they found this skeleton in 2006. It was a woman that was 75 years old, from the 1500s, that had a big chunk of stone chiseled in between her mouth, so she couldn't close her mouth. And why would they do that? Well, one postulation is that at this time there was a big plague in Venice, and they thought that vampires at this time, they were spreading the disease. So maybe because she was 75, which was a very high age in the 1500s, they thought that she had some kind of supernatural ability, so they better, you know, stop her from ever rising again or casting evil or disease upon the others. But also in another village in Poland, from the 1500s, they found 13 individuals that had their heads cut off, slitted, and their head was placed next to their legs, which is quite interesting. And this particular burial is quite interesting because if you read Roman authors, there's a Roman author called Titirenius. He said that one way to ward off vampires was to use garlic, supposed to be efficient, but the only way to kill a vampire was apparently to cut their head off and put the head next to the leg. And the myth of this undead rising and sucking blood is very old. It comes all the way from Sumeria, Mesopotamia, in Iraq, where there was a winged creature, a female creature called Leritu. It was an air demon that was inhabiting or living in the wilderness and that were looking for, in particular, children to suck their life energy or blood. And this myth later was migrating to Egypt around 3,800 years ago. There was a winged creature called Ba. Ba is an Egyptian word for drinking blood, actually. And this winged creature, there is an Egyptian poem called The Destruction of Mankind, where this mythical creature is wading in blood. Very bad creature. And then later on it was incorporated into Jewish religion, because if you read the Bible, Isaiah 34 and 14, there is a prophecy about the destruction of Edom, which was an ancient kingdom. And there you can read about the sword-wielding Yahweh, who is destroying this kingdom and causing it to become in utter desolation and ruin. And it will be inhabited, the prophecy says, by the goat demons, the wild animals, and the Levitut, which is this winged creature. Probably, you know, biblical authors were very careful to name demons, so probably this was a symbolic reference about, you know, the utter desolation that would happen to this kingdom. But what is interesting, as I mentioned, it later moved into Roman religion, where it is called the Strix, which is more like an owl-like creature, but it's also sucking blood. And the Roman poet Ovid, he mentions in one of his poems this creature. He's attacking a prince, a Roman prince, and he's trying to suck its blood out. So people have been afraid of the undead for a very long period of time. And actually, when the Romans colonized Dacia, which was a place where a lot of Roman merchants came into, they probably spread this belief of the Strix into that community, because there the word for vampire is Devoid, which is very similar to Strix if you look at it in mythology. And also it's interesting because Herodotus, which is a 5th century BCE historian, he writes about that the people in this area, they worshipped a god called Salamokis, which was a man that had been resurrected from the dead, sort of. He was immortal, and he lived in the underworld in a chamber. And every 4th year, the people in Dacia, they sent an emissary to this kind of ghost by throwing the emissary, the lucky emissary, into the air and letting him be pierced with spears. And maybe this is not so strange that we have, you know, later in history, Vlad Trepes or Vlad Dracula, that's favorite way of killing enemies is actually to pierce them on poles or stakes, which later turned into the legend of the vampire or the Count Dracula. But in any case, it seems like the vampire is sort of a mix of this Roman Strix, which actually derived from Mesopotamia, and this god Salamokis. So it was sort of a fusion, and when they later become Christian, they stopped burning their dead, they buried their dead, and thus the fear of the undead sort of was sprang up, so to speak. So that was a little bit crash course about the legend of vampires and the archaeological evidence for vampire funerals showing that people were really afraid of these creatures. Now people have speculated why people thought that there were vampires. Some say that it was because there's a physical illness called vampire disease, which makes your hand looks like this. It deforms the skin. And you can actually not tolerate the sun. It makes you get like blusters and it's not very nice for the skin. And the only way to treat it today is to inject hemp, which is part of the substance of the blood. And maybe at that time, the only way to treat it was by drinking blood or something like that. So maybe it has like a medical explanation, but we don't know. It's a mystery. But in any case, vampires are fascinating people. They're making movies of vampires. It's still fascinating us archaeologists, and that's about it. Any questions?
Domande? Grazie per questa importante e interessante presentazione. Se qualcuno vuole fare delle domande, chiedete qualcosa.
So, for example, I know about the Roman author about vampires. So they inherited the news about vampires from Iraq, from the east.
Yes, it first came actually to the Greeks. The Greeks also has this mythical creature. So probably the Romans inherited from the Greeks, and the Greeks inherited from the east. But it dates all the way back to 4,000-year-old and this mythical creature.
Yeah.
So it's quite a long.
But in Greek authors, we don't have any mention about vampires.
We have this not the specific word vampire,
Yes,
but you have this creature.
topic.
But you have the same kind of creature that also you need to decapitate.
The only way to stop them is
to cut their head off.
And put down near the feet.
Yeah, they found a lot of burials, 100 burials in Bulgaria, where they actually drove iron rod through the chest, because weapons that is forged in fire is believed to have anti-demonic properties.
Yeah.
So it was thought that if you drove a stake through, that would stop the dead from risen again. But it's fascinating why people were so afraid, taking all this trouble to bury people like that. I read actually a medical journal from the 1800s where two doctors are taking notes about a person that was dead or died, and the corpse was not it doesn't start the process of decompose, yeah. So the villagers in this town, they were really afraid, so they decided to cut the head off and the arms off and to bury
They are afraid from this.
That this person would rise again. And it seems like people are very afraid of the dead to be costing ill fortune and disease upon the living and sort of that kind
Yes, the only tradition that I know about vampires is about the wooden pole to kill them with a wooden pole in the chest. Then I never know about the treatment of removing the head.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Stan Broker's vampire has little to do with the vampires of what the kind of vampire creatures people in ancient times believed in. Because there's no mention in the mythology that these creatures only were night active or that light would stop them or anything like that. This is just fictional invention. I think it came from the Hollywood movie Nosferatu from the 1923 or something like this. To make it more interesting.
Now in the modern times they mix something, from the
it's a Hollywood invention sort of, to make it more interesting. But folk religion tells a completely different story. It's sort of zombies. And you can still see it in folk religion in Africa. People are actually very afraid of the dead, and they try to do all kinds of things with the dead to make sure, rituals to make sure that
they will rise. Okay, so any other question about? Nessuna altra domanda? Nessun dubbio? Quindi,
yes.
Is there a correlation between the popularity of people being afraid from vampires and actually crisis in the society of people?
Yes, in Venice, for sure. I mean, they think because of the plague in the 1500s were killing a lot of people, they think that maybe, you know, that there was this folk belief that vampires actually spread diseases. So absolutely, you're right about that. In the other places, there's no evidence. This is just postulation, but it's a known fact that they were thought to spread diseases. So and here we have actually an example of it. It was a very interesting discovery.
There was a link in
There was a link in this case. And probably they also thought that, I know how it was in Sweden, for example, when somebody, especially if there was a woman and she was clever, and there was a village, they thought she was a witch, because women cannot be clever and you know, all that. So it must be Satan that has, you know, given her this craftiness and cleverness. So we have to burn her on the stake. So it was probably a similar situation here, you know. She was very old, 75. So how can everybody else is dying in the plague? And so it must be something, you know, fishy with this one. So we better give her a vampire, you know.
Bene, se non ci sono altre domande noi ringraziamo il nostro ospite, Philippe Böhstrom. So we are thanking you for coming and to give to us this kind of topic, un nuovo spunto di riflessione e nuove informazioni. Quindi grazie mille per la